Good afternoon, and hope you're all keeping well. And a couple of weeks ago I did a review of all the James Bond films, so I thought today I would talk a little bit about the James Bond novels, just the original ones by Ian Fleming, although I may touch on a couple of the others. So the first James Bond novel was Casino Royale, published in 1953. Originally, the original printers said, this book isn't very good, I don't think this is going to be worthy enough to print, but some bright spark said, well, we'll give it a chance and see what happens. And amazingly it became a bestseller, much to Ian Fleming's delight, who actually bought the publisher called Gildrose, and they became Ian Fleming Publications, and they published all the Bond films after that. So we'll go in order of preference as usual. So in last place, The Man with the Golden Gun. Ian Fleming was dying when he actually wrote it. He wasn't very well at all. He felt that the actual manuscript was not that good when he actually finished it, and he felt that it needed a lot of work, and he actually considered saying, maybe I should put this aside and doing something else. But the publisher said, well, it's not too bad, so maybe you should just start editing it and see what happens. So he did, but unfortunately he died about 2 weeks into the editing process. If you read that book, the first sort of 20 or 30 pages are really good. Bond comes back from, he was declared dead at the end of You Only Live Twice, I'll come back to this in a second. He magically reappears, kind of a bit like at the start of Skyfall, except it's nowhere near as well handled in the film. And he's basically been brainwashed by the KGB to kill M, which fails. He's then what's called deprogrammed, and then he's given the job of tracking down this Cuban hitman called Francisco Scaramanga, the man with the golden gun, who's hiding out in Jamaica. And after that, it kind of starts falling downhill. There's a lot of, Bond is basically recruited to be his secretary, and all he does is basically listen at doors through a glass, kind of like that. And then he eventually hears that Scaramanga wants to kill him. Scaramanga's plan is to get the KGB and the Mafia and various other people involved in the scheme to destabilize the sugar industry, which is not really very bold. And it all culminates in a big fight on a train, which again is something that reoccurs. Bond then at the end is injured, but he survives. And they try to knight him, but he says, I'm a humble Scottish peasant, and that's how the final book ends. Fleming actually intended it for it to be the final book of the series, but of course it ended up being the final one that he wrote because he passed away. The story is not great. I think if he'd managed to live, it would have been better, but we'll never know. Next one is The Spy Who Loved Me. Bond hardly features in the book at all. It's about a woman who keeps getting dumped and thrown under the bus by all the men she meets in her life. At one point, a couple of nasty types turn up in the motel that she's working at and start doing nasty things. James Bond turns up, kills them both, and then disappears. That's the plot. Ian Fleming himself was not happy with it. He tried to break away from his usual formula, and he said himself, people just didn't like it, and I can see why. The only thing they allowed to carry over into the film was the title. Everything else had to be rewritten, which is why we ended up with a film that was completely unlike the book, for better. Next one is Diamonds Are Forever. So the basic plot is the same in the book and the film. Some diamonds are being smuggled by the Spang brothers rather than Blofeld, from South Africa through Holland to America, to Las Vegas, where the Spang brothers are basically just importing them for their own ends. Bond goes to investigate. He meets Tiffany Case. The diamonds have been smuggled in golf balls. He meets Felix, who of course was maimed by the shark in Live and Let Die. Again, I'll come back to that in a second. There's a car chase, just like in the film. He plays the casinos where he is told to earn his winnings by the Spang brothers. He earns more money than he was supposed to, and the Spang brothers basically take him to this weird town called Spectreville and get Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd to beat him up to find out who he is. They then escape, him and Tiffany Case, and Felix just happens to be driving past, which is rather convenient, and they basically kill Wint and Kidd on the liner going back to England, and then he goes to South Africa to kill Jack Spang at the end of the book. So the film and the book, neither of which are particularly brilliant, although I will give props to the film for being extremely entertaining and fun. The book, the basic idea is fine, but it just doesn't hang together very well, and it just takes forever to get to the point. Not one that I would recommend. Next one is Live and Let Die. Cover your ears, this book is extremely racist and very, very dated. The plot of the book, Mr. Big is using gold coins which have been found on wrecks in Jamaica and using them to sell them on the black market to raise money for Smersh, who is in the book is their version of Spectre. They changed it from Smersh to Spectre because Cubby Broccoli realised that this would, James Bond was a global thing. The book and the film, a little bit similar. There's actually a lot more ends up in License to Kill, the film. Bond goes to New York, he meets Teehee, he gets his finger broken just like in the film where he says, snip Mr. Bond's little finger off, then move on to the vital areas. He kills Teehee, he gets with Solitaire, they travel down to Florida on a train, the train is bombed and there's a couple of attempts on their life. Felix is then fed to the shark, and then there's the shootout in the warehouse, which is in License to Kill. They then get to Jamaica, where they take on Mr. Big on his private yacht. Bond attaches a limpet mine to the yacht before Mr. Big drags him and Solitaire over a coral reef to be fed to sharks, just like in For Your Eyes Only. The mine explodes, and that's it. That's the end of the book. As the plots go, it's not great. It's an okay read, but it's very, very dated. And like I say, if you're offended by racism, don't read this book. Yeah, I will just give you that proviso. Next one, Casino Royale. The plot of the book is basically the same as the middle part of the film. Bond is given the assignment to go and track down a Shifra, who is basically losing lots of money to various cartels, and he's spending money on brothels and things like that. This is something that crops up a lot in Fleming's work. He has this very weird thing about sex, and it has to crop up all the time in his work. So people are either victims of it or they've got weird fantasies and stuff, and it's kind of like, this is a bit uncomfortable to read. I just thought I'd warn you of that. So again, he takes on the Shifra in the casino. At one point he gets a gun stick put in his back by a bunch of hitmen. He eventually wins. It's Baccarat rather than Texas Hold'em that he's playing. The Shifra captures him and tortures him after Vesper Lind is captured and put in the middle of the road. He crashes the car, which is a Bentley in the book, to blow a Bentley. And the Shifra tortures him to find out where the money is, although he's already sent the money back to London. He's already actually achieved his aim in the book, which is better than the film, in which Vesper, So in the book, the Shifra's actually whacking him with a carpet beater. Mr. White is not in the book, and neither is Quantum or Spectre or any of that stuff. The Shifra is shot by the people he owes money to, and Bond has a acrylic sign carved into the back of his hand, meaning enemy spy. He escapes, he falls in love with Vesper, but then he realises Vesper's betrayed him, and she poisons herself in the book, and he says the bitch is dead, and he makes it his mission to take Smirch down. But he recovers the money and sends it back to M. Pretty simple story. I think that the book actually plays out better than the film. Bond is introduced. He introduces himself as Bond, James Bond. He has a vodka martini, shaken and not stirred. All of that is taken straight from the book. Q does not feature in the books. The way that the books are written actually is mirrored in the films. His entire assignment's given to him. We know the entire plot within the first 5 pages. He gets called into M's office. In the books, M is Sir Admiral Miles of Messavie. He gets called in, given his mission, usually in the form of a letter or a memo or something like that that lays out the entirety of the story, and then from there we're off to the races and Bond goes off and does his mission. They play out pretty much the same in the book and the film. There are very, very few twists and turns. Fleming is what I would call an info dump writer. He lays out everything in 4 or 5 pages. The thing about Fleming is he details every single thing that Bond does in nauseating detail. When we get to Goldfinger, which is the next book on the list, the golf match in the film lasts for 5 minutes. In the book, it lasts for 35 pages because he describes every single swing and play and walk and hole that Bond is playing. And it goes in ad nauseum. The book and the film of Goldfinger are actually extremely close. They play out virtually the same. The only difference is that Goldfinger, when he's got him on the table and he says, you know, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die. In the book, he says, Mr. Bond, you're going to tell me who you work for and what you know. And Bond actually says, and I quote, Goldfinger, go fuck yourself. Yep, and there's a lot more swearing in the books than there is in the films. It's actually a buzzsaw in the book, and Goldfinger makes the mistake of making Bond his secretary. And Bond then finds out what he's doing, Operation Grand Slams, to empty Fort Knox rather than blow it up with a nuclear bomb. Pussy Galore, of course, is in it. She's the leader of a group called the Cement Mixers, which is a all-female flying club. She's a lesbian in the book, very obviously a lesbian. In the end of the book, it's Oddjob who gets sucked out of the plane. Bond beats Goldfinger to death with his bare hands. Big plot hole at the end, of course, because they're going to try and empty Fort Knox. This is not possible because of the army next to it. They sort that out in the film. The film plays out far more entertainingly, I would say, than the book. It doesn't have the same sense of humour, and Sean Connery's, you know, obviously a lot cooler. Next on the list is You Only Live Twice. It's kind of a weird book. This is actually the first Bond book I ever read. Was I was 14. I saw the film and loved it. So I read the book, I got it out of the library, and I was really disappointed that the Holodark Volcano with the space rocket and Little Nelly were not in the book. Amazingly, everything else is. So Blofeld, he's running a clinic called Dr. Shatterhand. He lives in a castle surrounded by a garden of death, which has loads of death traps in Japan. Bond goes to Japan on a mission to basically go to see Tiger Tanaka, who's head of the Japanese Secret Service, and says, you know, I've got some information. It doesn't work, they've already got the information. He gives him, Tiger gives Bond a memo, and on the memo it says Russia is planning to strike at Britain and America with atomic warheads and trigger World War III, and Britain will be wiped out in the crossfire. Roald Dahl took that 2 sentences and created the whole plot of the film around it. So yeah, the plot of the film is taken straight from the book. At the end, Bond gets into the Garden of Death. He takes on Blofeld. The tank full of man-eating piranha fish is in the book, although it's a lake in the book and somebody falls in and gets eaten by the piranha fish. Bond strangles Blofeld to death while saying, "Die, Blofeld, die," just like at the end of No Time to Die. It's not a bad read, it's just kind of a bit weird and quirky. It's not for everybody. Next book is Dr. No. Dr. No, the book and the film are virtually identical. There are just a few changes. Professor Dent is not in the book, and neither's the bad girl at the consulate. Bond fights a giant squid, as like I've talked about before. That was not included because they just didn't have the money to do that. The biggest difference is probably with Honey. When Ursula Andress comes out to sea, she's wearing a bikini. In the book, she is stark naked, and Bond takes her in and is really enjoying the view. Apart from that, they're pretty much exactly the same. Dr. No is kind of a little bit more robotic. Okay, so yeah, Dr. No, good read. The next book is On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Again, the book and the film play out exactly the same. There's a scene where Bond pursues a guy who is observing him when he's at the Heraldry Institute, meeting Sir Hilary Bray, and then of course he goes to Switzerland to find out what Blofeld is up to. In the book, it's not a global plague, it's just a plague designed to target Britain. Apart from that, the book and the film are pretty much exactly the same. Dialogue at the end when Tracy gets murdered is exactly the same as in the film. we have all the time in the world. That's how the book ends. My next choice would be Thunderball. Thunderball was originally a script by Ian Fleming and a guy called Kevin McClory. They got into a big lawsuit over it, which lasted for years and years, and it got very, very ugly. Eventually they made the film. The book and the film are exactly the same. There's not really much to say there, apart from it's not a Vulcan bomber in the book. It's called a Vindicator, fictional plane, but the actual appearance, the way it's described, is exactly the same from book to film. It's a delta wing bomber that's capable of carrying atomic weapons. Not a bad read, but there are better ones, I think. Next one is Moonraker. Now, Moonraker, the book, is nothing like the film at all. If you were turned off by the film, which I can understand why, the book plays out very, very differently. So Hugo Drax is a neo-Nazi. He has built a V2 rocket called Moonraker, which he intends to use to destroy London with an atomic warhead, under the guise of a guy who is very benevolent. He gives money to charity and all that kind of stuff. The book, like I say, is completely different. The Bond girl in it is not Holly Goodhead. Her name is Gala Brand. There's a big car chase in which Bond's Bentley gets written off and destroyed while chasing a Goldwing Mercedes. He has a right-hand man called Krebs, who's a really nasty type. There's a great fight between him and Bond. At one point, so Hugo Drax tries to drop one of the White Cliffs of Dover on 007 and kill him with a landslide, which is a really good section. And he tries to leave Bond and Gala under the rocket motors of the Moonraker to be fried, and they escape through a ventilation shaft, which is just about the only thing that carries over from the book to the film. A really good read. A really, really good read. I really enjoyed that one, but my favourite Bond novel is also my favourite Bond film. It's From Russia with Love. They play out exactly the same. They're after the decoding machine. In the book, it's called the Spectre. It was changed to the Lecter because, of course, in the book he's up against Smersh rather than Spectre. Bond actually doesn't appear until the first 100 pages into the book, because the first 100 pages are all about Smersh and their training and stuff like that. So yes, Red Grant is being trained by Hagface, and then they have the fight on the train, the Orient Express. The very end of the book is a little bit different to the way it plays out in the film. The boat chase is not in the book, and neither is the scene where he gets buzzed by a helicopter. That is the only real difference. The only other book that I would like to mention is Colonel Sun. There's been a lot of stuff taken from that book, placed into the films over the years. Written by Kingsley Amis, writing under the name of Robert Markham. It was written after Ian Fleming's death. It's a very good book, actually. It's not bad at all. In the book, Colonel Sun actually tortures Bond by drilling into his head, like in Spectre. The short stories, they're not bad. There's a couple of them are pretty good, like the Hildebrand Rarity. That's where Milton Crest comes from in License to Kill, and he beats his wife with a thing called the Corrector, which is a fishtail. And Bond absolutely hates him because he hits women, and Bond does not like that because of his old school values, and rightly so. Risico and For Your Eyes Only, of course, became For Your Eyes Only the film. That's probably the best of the films that were based mostly on the short stories. Octopussy is based on A Property of a Lady, which is where the Fabergé egg comes from. A View to a Kill is about a dispatch rider that Bond is sent to kill in Paris. That's pretty much the only thing that carries over to the film. The movie has a plot that's based pretty much on Goldfinger. And then Living Daylights, the actual opening, where Bond is sent to Austria to kill the assassin, obviously ends up in the film. That's actually taken straight from the short story. So a few other things that play out in the films, like scenes from Casino Royale, end up in Dr. No, where he introduces himself as Bond, James Bond, although it's to Felix he introduces himself, not to Miss Trench. In general, I think that the films are probably more accessible than the books, but the books are good reads, but bear in mind they are very, very dated. Lots of the language, you would probably find them quite offensive now if you're below a certain age, say after you were born after about 1999. But that was the style that they were written in at the time, so don't change anything. I think that they're not bad. I certainly don't think that they're as accessible as the films, but maybe the films will get you to read the books. As for the actors that play James Bond, Timothy Dalton is the closest to the literary version of Bond. Bond in the books is not very suave at all. He's pretty much a grumpy alcoholic. He hates his job. He repeatedly says, "I'll thank M for firing me if he wants to fire me." He doesn't like his job, but he's good at it anyway. A bit like Callan in the James Mitchell books and show. He loves his drinking, he loves his food, and he likes to dress well. He's described as a blunt instrument, but he doesn't play it like Daniel Craig does. Daniel Craig's just a ruffian. Bond is more sophisticated than that. He's not suave like Connery or Moore or Dalton. He comes actually closest, I would say, probably to Matt Helm or something like that, if you've ever read those books. But yeah, overall, good reads. I really enjoy them, and I think you would really enjoy them too. Thank you very much for watching, and see you later.